Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Dispatch podcast. My name is Cameron English. Excited to be with you as always. Joined by Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, Director of Medicine at the at the American Council on Science and Health. It's the middle of the week. I don't know what to tell you. We are ACSH. It's great to be here. Chuck, how are you?
I'm wonderful. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, and after several days of rain, so our drought levels are well in control.
Very good. Well, water's good, essential for life. And we've got a great story. I say that every week, Chuck, but it's usually true. I'm biased, but nevertheless. This is an article you wrote. It's called "We Were Warned, We Still Failed." This is about pandemic preparedness, and you're riffing on a much longer article in the journal Public Choice, which, as we were just saying, we read at the dentist office when we go. It's great for that that venue. This is by economist Alex Tabarrok, and it's helpful. We'll get into why in a little bit, but let me read this introduction here and then take it away and explain what we're talking about. So, you write, "It's easy to promise readiness for the next disaster. It is much harder to maintain the political and public will to prepare. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed leadership failures and systemic design flaws that left us exposed. We built a pandemic response system optimized for appearances rather than effectiveness. A recent review moves past partisan narratives, offering a sharper, more unsettling diagnosis. Our institutions failed because they were designed against our very human nature." Okay, maybe you could start there. What do you mean by that, to say that our institutions are designed to work against our nature?
Well, let me take it back one further step. I love the article because it echoed 6 years of surgical training. The hallmark for me of my surgical training was the weekly morbidity and mortality conference, where you had to get up and explain the previous week's errors to your peers. And that required you to be reflective on what had gone on. And to be honest, the more reflective you were and the less you claimed it was the patient's fault, the better your skills and analysis became. And it was very helpful in the fact that you began to see over time some of the places where you had blind spots and biases. I was always very much more optimistic and expected things to turn out better than they might. And so oftentimes I was a little slow to the uptake when I was dealing with a complication that I should have recognized sooner. But, I kind of learned about that, and I learned that was a failing on my part, and found ways to adjust to it. And I think that what Tabarrok did in this article was the first time that I've seen anything talking about the pandemic that took into account the errors that we made that were due to our human nature. And I think that there's a few. So let me say what several of them were. So he talked first about the fact that we were not prepared we were not prepared despite the fact we'd received a number of warnings under that kind of crying of wolf scenario that people had been saying for several years, that it's just a question of when, not if, and it was just so much noise in the background that nobody paid any attention to it. More importantly is what I would call the curse of Jack Welch, which is the concept of short-termism. And Jack was a big fan of showing quarterly profits for his company as he drove it in the long run into the ground. And politicians and voters are both that way. Voters are very interested in what you've done for me lately, and politicians deliver on that. So when you talk about preparation for events that may or may not happen in the future, short-termism is its enemy. The other point that he makes that I enjoyed was what he calls the prophet's paradox, is that the better we are at preparing for catastrophe, the harder it becomes to justify and sustain those measures. And I will use one word to give you an example of how that remains to be true: measles. we have become so effective with the vaccines in preventing measles that we've allowed an entire generation to make their own personal assessment and say they don't need to have the measles vaccines. And we're seeing how that plays out now in our American Southwest. Another point that he made is that we use the heuristic that actions speak louder than words, so that politicians are far less inclined to carry out actions which can be traced back to them and are more willing to talk about what they're going to do. And as a result, during a pandemic, leaders did not make as many thoughtful decisions as they might because they were afraid that they would be making errors and held politically responsible for them at some later date. So instead, they made some bad errors which they were held politically responsible for down the line. And the last point that Alex made was specifically with respect to pandemics is that humans have a difficult time understanding pandemic growth or exponential growth. And we don't realize that we have a very short period of time to contain the problem before it gets out of hand. The Chinese acted within a month of the first cases in Wuhan to close down the entire city of Wuhan and to close down transportation. In the United States, it took us nearly 8 weeks, nearly 2 months, almost double the time. And that is part of why we had the problems that we had. I mean, that was an interesting thing that Tabarrok began with, is he pointed out that the number of deaths that we experienced from the pandemic were greater than the number of deaths that we experienced in all of the wars since World War II. And that kind of hit me as an interesting way to look at it.
So his solution, and there's multiple, but I think the underlying thesis he's going for is you need to somehow divorce all of the perverse political incentives from our disaster preparedness decision making. I think that's what he's getting at, and I think this is one of the key insights of public choice theory, which is just a school in economics, which seems to be that you start with human nature as it is. And a lot of people in public policy and in public health make this mistake, I think. They treat the public as like human clay that can be molded and shaped and ordered around, and then we'll have the optimal solution because we can make you do what we think is best. And what he's saying, I think, is there are clearly some factors here that are intransigent. They're not going to move. You're not going to force them. So find a way around them, I think, is basically what he's getting at. What would you say? Is that a fair assessment, do you think? And do you think his solutions are going to work?
I think that a number of his solutions will work. I mean, I had some questions about one or two which we can touch upon. But I think that, again, like Morbidity and Mortality Conference, if you paid attention to where the human frailties were in your decision making, you could learn to find ways to compensate for it. And he offers several ways to compensate for human nature to go with the flow rather than to go against that. And God knows that humans as a species are very inclined to want to fight for what we want rather than to go with the systems that are designed by nature. So, okay, I understand that, vaccines kind of go against the flow, but in another sense, vaccines are just a way to amplify and augment our immune system. They kind of go with the flow. We found some ways to build upon it rather than some of the ways that we came up with during the pandemic. So the ones that he mentions that were very automatic was wastewater surveillance, which is continuous and passive. You don't have to ask about it. You can surveil the water. If there's going to be a rising infectious disease, it will begin to show up in our wastewater. Interestingly, as you think about it, would also have told us perhaps of the rise of the opioid crisis, because they would also show up in our wastewater. The other one he mentions is prediction markets, which is kind of an economic play, or comes from the wisdom of the crowd. When you gather a large number of diverse and independent voices, the wisdom of that cohort is often very, very good. I think the difficulty with that is, since these markets are basically at this point on the internet, they're open to a lot of gaming, and that there's certainly the possibility of a, air quote, bad actor sending in the chat bots to put in a lot of opinions that are not necessarily independent, and that throws off how that's done. He also talked about vaccine libraries and repositories where scientists would evaluate vaccines for a variety of diseases that we're concerned about and do the basic phase 1, phase 2 studies, make sure that they're safe, make sure that they have no significant harms to humans, and stop at that point. Because when he talks about Operation Warp Speed, the year that it took in developing those vaccines, most of the year was spent in doing the various phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 testing. The time to develop the vaccine was probably about 2 weeks, and the rest of the time was spent in testing. So he felt that if you could pre-prepare these vaccines, you could cut a lot of the time out of that. And that very much goes along with, again, the way I was trained as a surgeon, is that you have plan A, and because plan A often will not work, there has to be a plan B and a plan C, and if you're very concerned, a plan D, so that you and the patient all get to go out of the room happy and content in an hour or so.
So I like the overall approach of this, and I think it's a great shift in emphasis that would help us with a lot of the decisions that we make. But I am nonetheless a little skeptical of some of these. Sometimes it's the ideas themselves, but other times it's the buy-in you would need to get from people to make these work. So for example, early on in the story, he talks about the failure of the strategic national stockpile, and he points out that they weren't even accumulating. They had accumulated millions of N95 masks, but most of them were over a decade old. They were just rotting because they weren't being maintained, they weren't being replenished or whatever. And then he goes on and he says, if an agency whose primary goal is preparedness is unprepared, it's no surprise that other agencies with different primary goals were also unprepared. Now, I think that's a fair point, but nevertheless, I think it also could possibly undermine his thesis, because his whole point is we need these agencies that do this one thing, and they're prepared, and they're somewhat immune to the political infighting that goes on in Washington. And there's other examples he gives too, where I think the same criticism holds, where we sort of have these, at least we're supposed to, and they've been compromised by politics to a certain extent. What do you think of that?
Well, it's true. And part of the reason they get compromised is I think in how they're created. So if you look at these strategic stockpiles, that sounds like a very static grouping. And we've accumulated 2 million N95 masks, or whatever number you want to put there. But to let them sit in the warehouse for the next 10 years is just not going to be good. So what you really need to think about is a much more dynamic warehouse, where that is the backup for the country, and you're constantly replenishing that and sending those masks out to be used by the public. That way you have kind of a up-to-date collection of material to work with, and that doesn't seem to be something that the powers that be recognize as important to do. Everything seems to be kind of, when we talk about these preparations, fairly static, rather than recognizing that the dangers that we're concerned about will change and morph over time. And so, you're right that these are not certainly foolproof, but they do get around some of the problems that were there. And I think another one that he talked about was having that pandemic trust fund, because again, talking about Operation Warp Speed, they had difficulty finding money to pay for it, not because the money wasn't available, but because it appeared that they were taking money from, somebody else's pet project and putting it into that, and that raised a lot of political concerns. So having that kind of dynamic pile of money, or at least having already had congressional approval to spend this kind of money without any questions, would get around those human problems of not from my money, not from my backyard, not from my money. The two points that he made that I had some concerns about, and I guess these were more ethical / practical than practical by themselves, was first the human challenge trial. So a human challenge trial is that we deliberately give individuals an infection to see whether the preventative measures we're using are effective. And one, that runs kind of against our oath to do no harm. And two, it raises the fear of another Tuskegee-like incident. And so I think that they were valid concerns. He got around it by saying that this was really a project that the military could carry out, because the military is bred on the idea of sacrifice by the individual for the collective good. And while that made some kind of sense, I just wanted to remind him of the phrase PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think that, again, in the same way that doctors would be very hesitant to deliberately infect somebody with a disease to see whether the treatment works, you might find those mid-level commanders that are actually telling the troops to go on into the room, they'll be having a nice time eating the special food they're given, will have the same kind of difficulty. So I think that there's a little difficulty with that. The other one he brings up, and this is also kind of a current concern, is the idea of the public-private partnerships. And he points out that Operation Warp Speed was just such a hybrid chimera activity, and that the ability of the private sector to act quickly and get something done was critical to developing those vaccines. And while that seems to be a really good case to discuss, I have real concerns, and that boils down to one word: DOGE, our Department of Government Efficiency, which is another public-private enterprise that I personally find significant problems with, because of the meat cleaver they have taken to the kernel of truth that was there.
Yeah, on the challenge trial thing, it's amusing because he's sort of like a libertarian-leaning commentator, and of course he's writing about public choice, which has roots in libertarian philosophy. But at the same time, you can sense this tension, because he's like, well, let's just let the military do it. And if you don't like it, well, people are going to die anyway. And, efficiency is worth the, you know what I mean? Like, he's got a very utilitarian sort of, each life is worth this many dollars. And if we just run the model right, it'll work. It's a little bit removed. My first thought as I was reading that passage was, well, it's easy to say, right? You're not going to probably be the one injected with the virus, and you're not going to be...
Bingo. Not only you're not going to be the one injected, you're not going to be the one doing the injecting.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. So I don't want to undersell that ethical concern, because he makes the point that, when you do a randomized trial, that takes much longer, and people are like, it's premised on the fact that people are going to get infected. And I get that point, but at the same time, there's something to be said for the people involved, right? Like, you can't make ethical decisions collectively like that. Everything would fall apart if we did that, because anything becomes justifiable. if you're thinking as, this is a block of people that I can move around, right? I was kind of surprised to hear that from him, frankly. But to his credit, one of the things he said that I did like was, as you said with the prediction markets, if you can decentralize access to information and you can decentralize decision making, you can sort of prevent the kind of foot dragging that you saw from CDC and other agencies, where they were just, and you've made this point as well, that they were frozen still because they were afraid of being blamed for a problem later on, and so no decision got made, and that ended up killing people as well. The one concern I have is that those same agencies, CDC, NIAID, different political actors, they are going to object wholesale to losing control of the flow of information. And we actually saw that pretty clearly during the pandemic, that when you had people outside of this very tight-knit circle of experts in a given field, when people started crunching numbers and looking at the data, we got a real intense pushback saying, and trust the science is a cliche, right? But like, we're the experts and we're going to tell you what the information is, and we'll give you access to it when we think you are responsible enough to handle it, this kind of rhetoric. So I'm wondering if, even when he does have great ideas, they might be killed in the crib because the people who, as I said, you need their buy-in, they're not going to give it to you. What do you think?
There's certainly that possibility, and I think that we have to, part of what's going on is a redefining of the balance between local and national control over things. I think that's one of the great lessons of the pandemic. Were masks and closing down systems important in New York? I think so. Were they as important in North Dakota? Probably not. And we didn't allow the local authorities to adjust the guidelines for their local conditions. We took that, we took too aggregate a view of things. And the free flow of information was critical, and I think one of the things that he talked about that I didn't mention in the article that I wrote was that a lot of the information did not come from the government. A lot of the information came from the universities. Johns Hopkins had the biggest COVID tracker going. That they were the ones that were able to quickly aggregate all the available data and start sharing that with the public. And, so I think the control of power always is a problem when you deal with humans. But again, I think what I liked the most about what he wrote was that he took the human condition into account. And that so resonated with, as I said, my own experience with having been a surgeon for 30 years, is that that ability to reflect upon what went wrong and what component of that was, I don't know, I would say your fault so much as, part and parcel of your worldview, was critical in making me a better physician. And I think it would be critical in making for better policy. We just, not something that we do.
It's great advice. And I don't think you actually need to be a surgeon to understand that, although your example is great. But for many years, I had a mentor who I would go to if something was wrong. I was struggling with a problem or something wasn't working out, and I would present it to him, and he would go, "Well, how did you get here?" I'm like, "Well, what do you mean? I need help. Like, stop telling me that, don't tell me to fix myself. Just help me solve it." And he was like, "Well, back up. This is how we do this, right? How did you get here? How are you going to prevent yourself from getting here in the future?" And I maybe that's the answer to my question. That's a very painful thing to do, especially if you're in charge of billions of dollars and thousands of employees and your decisions carry real weight. I could see why you would have sort of a psychological filter that would prevent you from going, "Man, I really screwed up on this one. I shouldn't do." So sort of from the outset, it's easy to do individually. But when you're in a position of power, there's a lot of pressure that comes with that. There's political influence. There's probably some hubris involved. And so maybe that's the challenge. Maybe that's the ultimate hang up to actually fixing these kind of problems.
Well, I think that it's true for all of us that we all have that problem. It may be more amplified for the powerful because it impacts larger numbers, or their ego is larger, so it's more fragile to do. But again. One of, having had the privilege of caring for other individuals, that responsibility can weigh very heavily upon you. And I think that we all have that experience, or many of us have that experience one way or another. I mean, you're a father of 2 little kids. There's a significant weight to that when you really look at it. And well, it's not going to be so easy to blame it on the video games and those cartoons you showed them, let alone all that sugar you feed them.
Yeah, it's the TV and the sugar's fault. It's anyone's fault but mine. That's the takeaway for today. As we wrap up here, I did find it funny that he had to sort of dance around certain issues, So, for example, he talks about at the beginning of the pandemic, most governments were slow to react because they were waiting for the consequences to drop before they did anything. And his point, of course, is that, well, once the consequences are here, the consequences are here. Yeah. And so you've defeated the purpose. But one thing he said was China, especially Wuhan, responded very quickly. And he says the speed of their response remained something of a puzzle. And just the cynical side of me said, well, what was going on in Wuhan that might have clued in the Chinese government to the problem with a new viral threat?
Right.
It's like maybe if there was a lab there and they were doing some kind of research. No.
Well, see, just to argue the other part is that was part of it also is the luck of the draw, is that whatever happened in Wuhan, whatever it was, happened just as we reached a very important Chinese holiday, when the country itself shut down and all of the people traveled to their homes. So you had this huge exodus out of Wuhan that you would not have had at any other point in the year. And so, there's always a little bit of roll of the dice, I guess, that has to do with why things develop one way or the other.
I'm gonna go get my tinfoil hat. I'm going for it, man. Well, and again, we obviously don't know how the virus originated. We probably never will, because there's information that you would need to look at that's not being released naturally. But nevertheless, I would encourage people to go read your story, which is a great summary, and then go read Alex Tabarrok's article. It's not behind a paywall, which I think is excellent. Apparently, most publicly funded stuff is not going to be behind paywalls anymore. We'll see if that happens. I was quite shocked at that. But yeah, go read this article. Great insight. And again, even if specific ideas don't pan out, I think the fact that he is encouraging people to think differently is helpful. Hopefully this gets a wide audience. I don't know if it will, but we'll see. So once again, the ominously titled article is "We Were Warned, We Still Failed." It was very widely read on our site. It was the lead story on Real Clear Science when it came out, which is always a great endorsement. So that means a lot of people got to see it. Go check this out. It's at acsh.org. When you go there, go to the subscribe tab, punch in your email address. We'll send you the stories we publish. The ones you read are the ones we usually talk about. And as always, thank you so much. We will see you next time.